Alright, welcome back. In the last video we did the basics of pick-upable items that affect our character. So something like this, where when we pick these up, we've got our flashlight on and off, and now we can sprint after picking up those items. In this next one we're going to do some more interaction with objects, but a bit more complex with line traces. So the interaction we have here is once we step on this invisible box here, something happens. But what if we want something like the character is pointing at something? Let's say it could be a melee attack and they want to attack forward. It could be you trying to open a door, and you don't want to use these box collisions because you need a bit more precision. What we're going to use is what's called a line trace. So what we're going to start off by doing is going into our third person character, and let's create where we want this sort of line trace to come from. And a line trace is basically just like if you imagine an invisible arrow sort of shooting out of your character. So let's actually make an arrow here. So let's add a component, an arrow, and let's just move it perhaps in the chest area like this, similar to where our flashlight is. Now once again, this is not visible in the game. If we hit play, we can see there is no arrow. If we wanted to, we could uncheck hidden in game, and now we can see that. But I'll show you why we won't need that in 1 second. And let's just rename this to our, if we rename that, and let's just rename this to our interaction point. Compile and save. So what we're going to do is go into our event graph, and let's start making some logic for this. So when we press the E key, like this, what we want to do is create a line trace by channel here. And you can see it's already looking a bit confusing. Not to worry. All it needs is, where is this line going to start and end? So we're going to drag in our interaction point, control drag. You can also drag these, but it's good to get in the habit of control dragging, because for our variables, when we control drag, that just brings out the variable alone, and if we alt drag, it creates a set. But if you drag it on its own, you get this quite annoying menu. Well, I think it's annoying. So let's just get our interaction point here, and let's drag off it a get world location. Perfect. What we also want to do is get what direction this arrow is facing. So let's have a get forward vector. Perfect. And how far forward do we want the arrow to go? So let's say around 200 units. So let's just go to vector times float, and let's multiply that by 200. And we can obviously adjust this and see how it looks later on. But for now, let's just stick with that. Now let's here add a vector plus vector here. And let's add these two values to give us our endpoint, meaning we've got the actual location where it starts, the direction it's going, how far we want it to go, gives us our endpoint, and so our start point is just going to be the location of the interact point. Perfect. So that should give us something already. So let's just turn on draw debug type to for duration, compile and save. Let's hit play, and now when we press E, we'll see we've got this line coming out. And if I spam that while looking around, you can see it's at a pretty good distance. Maybe let's make that a little bit shorter. Maybe let's say 150. So let's say we were trying to interact with this cube, that'd be roughly here. And you can see it's actually hit the cube, and it gives us this feedback of a miniature cube where it hits something. And where it passes through it, it changes to green. So that's quite useful for us to know if we're actually hitting something. So let's leave this debug on, because it's quite nice to look at and good to know if we're hitting something. Alright, so what do we want to actually do with this? So let's get it going for something like when we, let's change this to left mouse button, which is traditionally an attack. Let's say this is some sort of a mining type function. So let's compile and save this. Let's grab, if we go to our starter content here, props, let's grab this nice big old rock out in the open here. Let's scale that down. Let's say maybe 0.5, a little bit bigger, 0.65. Just see how that's looking. Perfect. That looks like some sort of node. And let's create a blueprint out of this. So if we select it and hit blueprint add script, let's call this a stone underscore node BP. And let's store it with our other blueprints. Create blueprint. And this time we're not going to use a box trigger. We're going to be using that line trace we just created. So what I'm instead going to do is create a health for this rock. So if we go to our variables here on the left and add a variable, and let's call this hit points. Let's actually make it a bit more specific. Let's call it node hit points. Perfect. And we don't want a boolean because that's just yes or no. So let's click here in the variable type and hit integer. Now an integer is just a whole number as opposed to a float, which could be 1.2, 1.4. Here we just want to have a simple health from 10 to nothing. So we don't need 9.5 health. So let's just compile and save that. And what you'll notice, what I just did there, is when you change the variable type, you actually have to compile it before your default value changes. So if we change it to an integer, we first need to compile it, and then we can enter our variable, which for now I've typed in 10. Alright, let's go back to our character. So when we hit the left mouse button and do our line trace, when we hit something, we need to check, first of all, did we actually hit anything? So let's go to our return value. Did we return something? And if we did, we can continue on. What we actually managed to hit, however, we want to break hit result. And then we want to get if it was an actor. So let's drag this out, hit actor, and let's get a cast to our stone node. Perfect. So if we did in fact hit something, we want to first check if the actor is our stone node BP, and let's get our hit points. Perfect. And now what do we want to do? We want to subtract hit points. So what we want to also do is hit set hit points. And what do we want to set it to? We want to set it to the current hit points minus 1. And you can see there's another option there, which is decrement, which we can use as well. I just prefer to be able to see exactly what we're doing here. So let's do our node hit points minus 1. But what happens if our node is already on, let's say, 0 health points? So what we're going to do is a bit of logic. So set the node hit points to hit points minus 1. But then also we want to check if our hit points now equal 0. And if they do, what do we want to do? We want to cast to our stone node BP, and we want to destroy actor. So every time we left click and successfully hit a stone node, we want to decrement the hit points by 1, and then we want to check, is the node hit points equal to 0, and if so, destroy the actor. Alright, so the next thing we need to do is select our static mesh component here, and we need to check this variable here, which is simulate generates hit events, to make sure that it's actually waiting to be hit by something, and that something is our line trace. While we're at it, let's actually add a bit of debug like I was talking about in our first video, and every time the game ticks, which is basically all the time, we want to print a string, and let's print what our hit points are on. So if we go into the game, we should see a lot of 10s on the left here. Perfect. Alright, last thing to do is make sure we've got collision enabled on this rock. So in our blueprint editor, let's go to our static mesh and double click it. And in the top left here, we've got this collision menu where we can select a couple different options for what style of collision we want. I'm going to go for this complex collision. You don't need to worry too much about the settings here, just hit apply in the bottom right, and you'll see it gives us a nice little mesh surrounding our object. So this is usually what you're going to want for something as complex as a rock, like we've got here. If we now get into the level and left click on it, we can see that incrementally our values in the top left there are going down. Let's go to 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0, and now our object is gone. Let's just do that again, and let's hold Alt and duplicate our blueprint. And while we're at it, let's just add a bit of feedback. So let's go to Add Component, Text Render. Set that to center, and set it to iron ore. And let's hit play. So now when we go into our level, we can see that it says iron ore above them. Let's click this one 10 times. Perfect. And let's click this one 10 times. Perfect. So we can now interact with objects by standing on them. We can activate things by clicking at them. We can adjust their variables. We can adjust our character's variables. We can add hit points, health. We can check to see if we have particular items. You've already got a really good toolkit for making a basic game. So once again, like I said in our last video, I really encourage you to take what you've learnt and try and make something all for yourself. So we've made an iron node here. Maybe try and make a wood node where you first need to pick up an axe before you can actually interact with it. Something like that.